Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the final installment of the REMI Client Series on Energy and Environmental Policy. Today's guest presenter is Dr. Stanley McMillen, Visiting Assistant Professor of Economics and Consultant at the University of Connecticut. During his tenure at UConn, he managed the Connecticut Center for Economic Analysis. He has taught economics at UConn, Trinity College, and Connecticut College. In addition, Dr. McMillen previously served as managing economist at Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development for 6 years and has performed consultant analysis on a variety of economic issues. Dr. McMillen earned his doctorate in economics from the University of Connecticut, and we are very pleased to have him join us here today. Following the discussion, there will be an opportunity to have your questions answered. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A submission portal on your screen. For your convenience, all registrants for this webinar will receive direct access to the webinar slides and recording via follow-up email. Please keep an eye out for it later this afternoon. Without further ado, I will hand it off to Dr. McMillen to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Dee. Welcome, everybody. This work was actually done in 2018 and 19. And it was funded, as you can see there, by the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, or NESCOM. Next slide, please. So, by way of background, the Connecticut legislature adopted the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2000. Actually, I can't see this. I'm going to move this over here. In 2008, and Connecticut set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state by 80% below 2001 levels by 2050. Governor Malloy at the time issued Executive Order 46 in 2015, which created the Governor's Council on Climate Change, of which I was a part. This group was tasked with examining the effectiveness of existing policies and regulations which were intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And primarily, our primary work was to identify new strategies to meet the state's 80% reduction goal. So next slide, please. The strategies to reach this goal included reductions in 3 major areas: transition to zero carbon vehicles in the transportation sector, in the building sector, building envelope improvements, as you can imagine, insulation, windows, doors, roofing, etc., building materials, building energy management systems and improvements, including high efficiency thermal systems, which is heat pumps, and decarbonizing the electric grid in the electric sector with zero carbon resources such as solar PV, wind, hydro, biomass, and nuclear. We have 3 nuclear generating plants in the state. Their licenses may or may not be renewed by 2050, but our intention, at least in the short run, is to keep them online and include them in our renewable or green sources of energy. Next slide, please. So again, we examined the environmental impacts of a consensus midterm result or target of 45%. So this midterm target was adopted by looking at a variety of REMI analyses to see what the costs and benefits would be over the period 20 to 2050. But obviously, as you go out further in time, there's much greater uncertainty. So we said we'll adopt a 45% target reduction from 2001 levels by 2030. And we will look at reducing greenhouse gases from transportation, the building and the electric utility sectors individually, and then all sources combined. Combine these 3 sectors into one overall analysis. The reductions are relative to a baseline or business as usual case. For REMI users, this would be the baseline case with a baseline forecast. So we decided, as I said, to focus on 2020 through 2030, even though we had simulation data to 2050, there's great uncertainty beyond 2030. So and 2030 was that midterm target. So we wanted to see what were the economic implications of adopting the strategies that we propose to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over this period of 11 years. Next slide, please. So in the transportation sector, in Connecticut, it accounts for about 35% of emissions in 2014. So reducing emissions from this sector represents a significant portion of the total that we must eliminate to reach the 2030 target. So how would we do that? Primarily by the electrification of passenger vehicles like light trucks, which includes SUVs, pickups, short-haul trucks, primarily delivery trucks, mail trucks, as you can imagine, all kinds of other delivery trucks, buses, primarily school buses, which are now diesel-powered and cause an undue amount of respiratory illness among children. Connecticut ranks number 7 in respiratory illnesses in the country, as well as commuter rail, which we did not include in this current economic analysis. So the other part of the transportation sector, long-haul trucks, diesel freight locomotives, ferries, and we have ferries to Long Island, and off-road construction equipment will also need to transition to alternative fuels, such as biofuel and propane, for example. But we did not include them in this analysis. Also changes to aircraft and watercraft, we did not assume any changes there for this analysis. So next slide, please. So we assumed that these greenhouse gas reductions are achieved with an estimated rate of electric vehicle, we call it EVs, uptake, and related changes in the charger infrastructure, electricity sales, retail gas station market exits as the demand for motor fuel declines. Gas stations would exit the market, and non-recurring, as they did, as gas stations left the market, there would be non-recurring gas station remediation. Clearly, people can drive by a gas station and see that they're digging up the tanks. Local laws and regulations require them to be replaced periodically, but those costs can be recouped with future sales. In this case, when the gas stations go out of business because demand for fuel has declined to a point where they can't come back to business, these are non-recurring remediation costs. In addition, we assume that there'll be an increase, a small increase in hydrogen-powered vehicles and their required filling stations. There was great hope that this industry would take off. It remains to be seen whether in fact it does. We used the Long Range Energy Alternative Planning System, or LEAP for short, a model that was run by NESCOM to provide the forecast for EV deployment and fuel consumption. So they would produce these trajectories of GHG reduction, which in turn said how much less fuel we have to consume and how much more electric vehicles would have to be sold in order to meet these targets. Next slide, please. So in the transportation sector, the primary reductions are achieved through electric vehicle sales, and we assume that there would be a one-for-one displacement of conventional vehicles with electric vehicles as the incentives, federal and state incentives remain in place, and as prices and charging times and ranges increase. Clearly, that's actually going on. The federal, everybody knows how the federal incentive works. It's a declining incentive as production ramps up. The state of Connecticut has an incentive per vehicle, which hasn't declined. In fact, we're increasing it as part of the work of the Governor's Council. So the other thing, obviously, as economies of scale in companies that are producing, like for example, General Motors and Volkswagen and other, Tesla, for example, as they scale up, their costs come down. Technology will reduce charging times and increase ranges as battery technology evolves. Charging stations in homes, businesses, shopping centers, public parking areas, we assume will increase as EVs deploy. It's a critical part of the Build Back Better bill. Obviously, people need places to charge their vehicles if they're going to be driving them around. We assume that there'll be a smaller growth in hydrogen vehicles and fueling stations relative to the electric vehicle, which we assume would be the primary mode of reduction of greenhouse gases. So obviously, and we've already seen this, this decline in gas station revenue because of the CAFE standards. Over the years, CAFE standards have improved or increased, and therefore fuel cars and trucks have become more fuel efficient. Gas station revenue has declined and will continue to decline as EVs displace gas-powered vehicles. So as they leave, as we mentioned before, they will incur a non-recurring cost of remediation. And we don't regard this as new investment. It's just it's a one-time cost. Next slide, please. So we assume that the state will find alternative revenues to make up the revenue shortfall from the gas tax. This is already happening across the country, as I said, as as vehicles become more fuel efficient, they consume less gas, there's less fuel tax revenue. In addition, the uptake in electric vehicles and hybrids has reduced gas consumption and therefore gas revenue. We assume that there will be other sources. Tolling is one source. In Connecticut, that died a very quick death. There was a huge outcry. We are talking about a VMT tax, vehicle miles travel tax, as well as a consortium of Northeast states on a regional pact to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It would be a cap and trade system. The gas tax shortfall arises that we use for REMI modeling arises from the differences between the reference case, that's a business as usual case, and the midterm target, where we show reductions in fuel consumption and therefore tax generation from the uptake of electric vehicles. Next slide, please. So obviously, there are health benefits from reduced greenhouse gas emissions from trucks and cars, sulfur oxides, nitrous oxides, and particulate matter. As I mentioned, Connecticut, partly as a result of its location and partly as a result of a lot of traffic flowing through the state, on the I-95 and the I-84 corridor, we have a lot of greenhouse gases and the resulting SOx, NOx, and PM, but we did not, and reductions in those would improve mortality and morbidity. And unfortunately, at the time that we were doing the study, the EPA had removed its COBRA model. A new president had been recently elected, and the EPA had changed the accessibility to that. So we did not model what we call the co-benefits, the health benefits that would accrue to decreasing fossil fuel consumption. The other things that we did not account for are the averted environmental costs, which includes adaptation. So what we're talking about here are mitigation measures, but we did not account for the cost, the averted environmental costs due to adaptation, and adaptation will generate new economic activity. You can imagine seawalls and raising houses on stilts, et cetera, hardening the grid, et cetera. So we did not estimate those, and therefore our results are understated because there would be additional economic activity as if we did. So switching from internal combustion engines to EVs results in an increased demand for electricity. So we assume this increased electricity increases commensurate with the needs of EV uptake. So next slide, please. We'll actually show these things graphically. So the primary driver of new economic activity is non-residential and residential investment in charging stations. Connecticut doesn't make electric cars. We don't make any parts for electric cars, batteries, or other things. So the primary activity with the uptake, so the new EV sales would primarily be retail sales. And we assume that instead of buying The next car being a internal combustion engine car would be an EV, especially as the prices come down, charging times go down and ranges go up, which we've seen improvements year to year. So the primary activity is chargers, and this results in, we broke this down into installation costs, maintenance costs, and hardware costs. And in the residential the non-residential sector, which would be public places, retail places, town halls, town centers, public parking lots, and so on, we see in 2030 an investment of about $80 million. So this pattern reflects what we imagined would be a spike in 2020, and then a lull as EV sales ramped up, and then they would take off. And we're talking about economies of scale being realized, rebates kicking in from new manufacturer entering the market, as we've seen, Ford, primarily Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, just about everybody and their brother has an electric vehicle either on the market or soon to come to market. Subaru, for example, and Toyota are to introduce new vehicles next year. So we anticipate an uptake in non-residential charging investment. The next slide, please, will show residential. Next slide, please. Well, residential investment. I'm planning to put a charger in my house. Clearly, this needs to be a 220 line with a special plug. Again, the pattern is very similar to the non-residential case, but the numbers, the magnitudes of the numbers are about half. So about 45 million, a little more than 45 million investment in 2030 from installing chargers in residential settings. Next slide, please. One of the biggest drivers will be the decline in fuel sales and the uptake in electricity sales. So the blue bars represent the business as usual, or the reference case, and we can see a slight decline. This is due to increasing CAFE standards down through 2026, and then a slight leveling off and possibly a slight uptake there, and that is due to an estimated increase, small increase in population. However, in the alternative case, where we're displacing fossil fuel powered vehicles with battery electric vehicles, trucks, buses, and cars, fuel sales will continue to decline. That's the orange bars. And these are billions of dollars on the left-hand scale. So next slide, please. These are retail sales. So in REMI speak, these affect retail sales. So this slide shows the decline in the number of gas stations. We had a count of the gas stations, and that's the gas stations in the blue, the existing, the business as usual case replicate the pattern of fuel sales. The red bars represent the gas station decline over time as fuel sales decline in terms of their numbers. The red line documents as these gas stations leave the market, there's a one-time remediation cost to dig up the tanks and the piping and so on, and restore the land to some level of building capability, whether it's for residential or non-residential occupancy. So next slide, please. And these costs, again, are entered into REMI. So the fuel tax shortfall I mentioned before, we count the annual fuel tax sales revenue differences between the LEAP reference case, which we assume is the same as the REMI reference case in terms of economic activity. The difference between that and the 45% consensus reduction midterm case in 2030 is these represent a shortfall that is a blow to the fiscal posture of the government. So this contributes to the economic and fiscal impact because these differences arise simply because of the Governor's Council on Climate Change GHG reduction strategy. So this next figure, if you will go to the next slide, shows the fuel tax revenue trajectory. So this fuel tax shortfall in this case represents a reduction in state spending, which we call service production, without state employment or compensation effects. And these are things you can specify in REMI when you specify changes to state spending. So next slide, please. So here we see that the reference case is in red. And again, the reductions in fuel tax are primarily due to the uptake without additional incentives, just as more efficient more efficient vehicles, more efficient fuel consumption relative to the, that's the business as usual case. But the reference case in the blue line represents our proposed or necessary uptake of EVs to meet the midterm target. And the difference in 2030 is about $100 million, which we assume will be made up through either increased fuel tax rates or tolling or vehicle miles tax, and there are a number of other strategies that the state and other states might adopt to meet these shortfalls. Next slide, please. The biggest issue here is that as we use less fossil fuel, we need more electricity. So the red line there represents increase in electricity, and this would be based simply on a projected uptake of hybrids and EVs. But in the 45% reduction case, where we must have an increased number of EVs on the road, not only passenger vehicles like trucks and buses, demand for electricity will increase dramatically. And this represents the electricity sales that are required to support the uptake of EVs over time. And again, these are the differences between the baseline, the red line, and the blue line are what we put into REMI. Next slide, please. So what happens to the, what is the net effect? So the blue bars represent increased electrical demand. And this is from all sources in the transportation sector. The red bars represent the reduction in fuel sales. This is retail sales reflected as demand. The green line looks at the net effect. And so what will consumers do with the money they save from consuming less fuel on the one hand and more electricity on the other hand? Well, this is positive up through about, according to our calculations, up through 2028, almost into 2029, and when it turns negative. So there, the savings from consuming less fuel is not as great as the cost of purchasing the electricity to power the vehicles. So we need to take account of all these effects. Next slide, please. So the bottom line, the REMI results here, and I chose to keep it simple, talk about gross state product and jobs, and the orange line is gross domestic product, and the blue bars are jobs. So, you know, our peak loss of jobs is less than 1,000. Most of these, if you look at the breakdown in REMI in the retail sector, again, the gross domestic product, most of that increase is in electricity sales, and that's where that primarily comes from. That you know, that's a net effect of the decline in fuel and the uptake in not only chargers but also electricity sales. Then we look at the fiscal effect on the next slide. Next slide, please. So the fiscal effect is that we're actually in a deficit here. Expenditures exceed revenues for the entire period by a little bit. These are actually very small numbers. Connecticut's budget is about a $22 billion budget, about a $275 billion economy. Just to scale these, so these are very small numbers, but nevertheless, it's a deficit. The primary reason is the loss of retail sales from gas stations and all the other things that they sell, as well as auto parts and so on. All of that kind of retail sales declines, as well as the declining shortfall, the declining revenue from fuel taxes. So let's go to the next sector. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In the building sector, the buildings in Connecticut, commercial, industrial, and residential, account for about 1/3 of Connecticut's emissions due to the lighting, heating, and cooling that they consume. Mitigation strategies, we would propose replacing existing oil and gas-fired heating appliances with electric heat pumps that both heat and cool spaces more efficiently, and hopefully will use electricity from renewable resources as they become available. In addition, building envelopes will become more efficient through installing increased insulation, weather stripping, and energy efficient doors and windows and household appliances. In addition, there are many building management systems that control internal and external lighting. Shades may come down automatically, reducing heat load and heat loss. Also adjusting lights automatically as rooms become less occupied, time of day, etc. As a consequence of these deployments, there'll be less demand for heating, oil, and natural gas. Some suppliers of these and complementary products and services will exit the market, but there will be a corresponding increase in demand for electricity as we replace gas-fired and oil-fired heating appliances with heat pumps. Next slide, please. Also, as I said there in the last sentence, that the additional costs are offset by energy efficiency investments, and we'll actually show what those are in great detail. So we assume that investment in electric heat pumps is net new. There's no state incentive to induce the switch from oil and gas-fired heating to these heat pumps. It's possible that there could be a federal tax credit, but our assumption, and I have to confess, it is a heroic assumption that businesses and homes will voluntarily spend the money, invest in a heat pump system. The rationale may be to a hedge against future costs and electricity and environmental damage. And the thought that some people will install, and businesses will install solar PV on their roof to offset the increased cost of electricity to power their heating and cooling heat pump. So the 45% midterm scenario that we modeled in LEAP, we separated the uptake of heat pumps for residential and commercial sectors, which allows us to separate the changes in demand for different energy sources. So we assume in this case that commercial establishments and residential households increase their demand for electricity at the same time as they reduce their demand for natural gas and fuel oil as heat pumps deploy. Many people in this part of the state, Northeast Connecticut and Northwest Connecticut, our only source of heat is fuel oil. Number two, fuel oil. There is no gas, there are no mains in the street, whereas in other big cities and along the coast of Connecticut, they have access to the gas pipelines in those areas. So next slide, please. So here what we show are the, in the building sector, the demand changes and the residential savings. So the blue line is the net savings. That blue line is the net savings to households. The blue bars represent the increased demand for electricity to power heat pumps for residential dwellings, and the red, green, and purple bars represent the declining demand, the reduced demand relative to the baseline for natural gas, diesel, which is number two, fuel oil, heating oil, and propane. So if people do want to heat with gas in this area of the state, they need to get propane. And so that LPG represents propane sales. Next slide, please. So here it is for the commercial sector. Again, the net savings are positive. because as you can see, the red bars are longer than the blue bars, and so the net is positive. So next slide, please. So we combine the investment in heat pumps for commercial and residential, and the blue bars represent the capital investment. The red and the green bars represent labor and material. They're identical because we just split the total cost in half. And then the purple bars represent wholesale markup for materials to do the installation, piping, wiring, and other fixtures to install heat pumps in residential and commercial establishments. So these savings are significant. If we go to the next slide, we can see the net. Oh, before we get to that, there's this other part called efficiency. So the state of Connecticut, I assume many other states, are making significant investments in energy efficiency. You can get your home have an energy audit. Based on that, they recommend doors and windows and insulation and weather stripping and so on. And so what we see here, the red line is the gas expenditure savings over time, simply based on the reduction in, or the increase in building efficiency. The blue line represents a reduction in electrical energy consumption from these investments in energy efficiency. And so by 2030, you can see that the millions of dollars saved are like, $2.2 million. So it's not a lot, but it's something. And these savings offset the cost of heat pump installation. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, before we get to the net, we'll see the commercial sector saving. Again, it's about almost 300 million if we add together the reduction in fuel oil consumption, or gas, natural gas, and electricity. So we go to the next slide, I believe we can see the overall net savings. Oh, before we get there, sorry. The LEAP model could actually break down the energy efficiency spending into sectors. And the biggest sector you see here at the top, the red line, is construction. So for installing heat pumps, we need plumbers and electricians, possibly carpenters. So it's primarily from the construction industry that spending is most increased. The other sectors there, retail trade, wholesale trade, are the other largest ones at the bottom. So we've taken account of all the spending that would go on to improve efficiency in this slide, combined residential and commercial and institutional. That would be hospitals, public buildings, town buildings, et cetera, schools, and so on. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the combined result. So this is residential, commercial, and institutional energy efficiency, total spending, and net saving for this case. So there's no change between 2020 and 2022. The green bars represent the total spending on heat pumps and the infrastructure to support them. The red line is the commercial net savings, and the blue line represents consumption reallocation for households. So initially it's negative, but then eventually by 2026 for consumers and by 2027 for commercial establishments, the net savings become positive. So next slide, please. So for the building sector, our REMI results are significantly different because there is a huge investment in heat pumps. The average installation may run anywhere from $12,000 to $20,000 to $30,000, depending on the size of the home or the establishment, or more. If we do this across most of the homes and business establishments in the state, we have gross domestic product increasing by almost $3 billion, a little bit more than $3 billion. Employment is a significant jump in employment, about 22,000 jobs, as primarily in the construction industry, but also all the related trades, as well as retail and wholesale. So next slide, please. There's a fiscal impact as well. Again, in this particular situation, the situation is reversed. We now have a net surplus, again, because of the significant growth in jobs and the taxes that individuals pay, that businesses pay, retail and wholesale, and the construction companies. So this is a good news for the economy. This is actually the biggest impact in the building sector. But again, I have to emphasize that it was a heroic assumption that the commercial, industrial, and residential sectors of the economy would voluntarily spend this money without any incentives, essentially as a hedge against increasing fossil fuel costs and environmental damage. A heroic assumption. Nevertheless, we made it to model this particular scenario. So now we go to the energy sector, the electricity sector. Next slide, please. So this is one of those sectors that is not easy to characterize. So what we need to do here is to decarbonize the grid as best as we can. And that means utilities need to switch to onshore and offshore wind, solar, biomass, and fuel cell, as well as households and businesses switching to or investing in behind the meter solar. That's on the roof, on the ground, and so on. So for REMI modeling purposes, we want to assume that the grid scale investment includes capital as well as fixed and variable operating and maintenance expenditure, O&M, and we aggregate the total under investment in this category called electrical transmission, distribution, and industrial apparatus sector in REMI. So that's where we put that. Next slide, please. Among our other assumptions are that this build out of solar, wind, fuel cell, biomass, which is a very small part, but all of this investment is financed with 20-year bonds earning a return to investment of 7%. A new tranche of bonds is issued each year as new investment funds are needed to continue the build out of the wind, solar, biomass, and fuel cells. Annual amortized grid investment is offset by annual increase in electricity cost to businesses and households. The average cost per kilowatt increase is roughly constant because each year the additional tranche of bonds to finance additional wind and solar and fuel cell capacity is spread over accumulating capacity. We assume that households and businesses will bear these increased costs of electricity without offsetting incentives because they recognize the importance of reducing GHG as a hedge against the cost of climate change, as I mentioned before. Similarly, we also assume the utilities undertake the investment in solar, wind, biomass, and fuel cells without any offsetting incentives because they recognize the importance of reducing GHG as a hedge against climate change. So again, this may be an heroic assumption, but nevertheless, we had to make it in order to continue with the model and see what these costs and benefits would be. So next slide, please. So for behind the meter solar for households, we imagine that this investment comes from the household's budget for maintenance, as it might for a new furnace or an air conditioning unit. This is a thought experiment in a way. So this is the way I imagined it. This is the part of the budget it would come from. We assume such an expenditure may be financed by a home equity loan, one from the Green Bank. Connecticut has a Green Bank with very low interest rates for energy-related investments, solar, heat pumps, and so on. We assume businesses would finance their solar installations through capital finance, perhaps by borrowing in the capital market or from retained earnings. This is not something that we modeled in REMI. So we model business behind the meter investment as occurring in the electrical equipment and not elsewhere classified NEC sector. That's where we put that business BTM investment. We know that there are other creative strategies for financing behind the meter solar. Leasing is one of them. So we didn't include that in our model because that doesn't show up as net new investment or expenditure. I think the strategy there is you continue to pay your electric bill on a level basis, and for that the installation company gets renewable energy credits, and there's a net gain to them as well. Next slide, please. Continuing with our assumptions in the electricity sector, households and businesses that would put BTM on their roof or backyard realize a reduction in their electric bills that reduces revenue to the electric utilities, which then increases revenue or the electricity rates to all users. However, we don't capture these increased rates accruing to all ratepayers as a result of the uptake of BTM solar, because rates differ across classes of users and they have several choices of electricity suppliers whose rates differ. So obviously, if Eversource, the primary supplier in Connecticut, that's the transmission and distribution supplier, they don't generate because of you know, they've broken up the generation and distribution. Eversource is not the only source of generation. So even if Eversource was to raise its rate, there are other sources, and these rates may differ. Again, the type of power you consume, whether it's a time of day rate or other rates. So it's a very complex issue to capture how these rates would increase. So in addition, the increased rates benefit the BTM users because we sell power back to the grid at retail prices. So if retail prices go up, it's an increased benefit to people who actually have solar. The net effect of the rate increase is difficult to allocate to different users, and therefore the net aggregate effect we don't model without significant additional research, and it's not clear that that would change our results much. So our modeling approach for REMI simply accounts for the reduction in the utilities demand for natural gas. Most power plants in the state of Connecticut are natural gas. I believe it's 57%. The other probably 30%, maybe 35% is from nuclear. There is some fuel cell, some wind, and some solar. So the reduction in natural gas demand offsets the utilities investment in grid scale renewable generation and behind the meter savings. So there is no effective reduction in revenue to the utilities from BTM production via net metering. And so if you put a solar on your house or business and you have a net meter, you use so much and you generate so much, and you essentially pay the difference at the retail rate. And it could be a credit. It could be either a debit or a credit, depending on how much you generate. We assume that households will spend their behind the meter savings on additional goods and services, while businesses would invest their excess BTM savings in new plant and equipment. Next slide, please. Continuing with assumptions, a lot of assumptions. You need to basically make assumptions to tell a story in this thought experiment as to how you imagine this transition from a carbon-based economy to a zero carbon economy occurs, and account for as many economic activities as possible across the spectrum of industries and households in the region. So we assume that households borrow at very low rates, for example, from the Green Bank, or lease to obtain BTM solar. They spend their electricity savings on other goods and services, even though their net BTM saving is negative from 2020 to 2026 inclusive, and their savings are positive after that. This savings, or net negative or positive net savings, which is we model as a consumer consumption reallocation, drives economic impact. Businesses realize a positive net saving from BTM from 2027 through 2030. And this is the amount that is additionally invested during that period and drives economic impact. Between 2020 and 2026 inclusive, we assume businesses invest in BTM solar with retained earnings or by going to the capital market to obtain the needed funds. We assume that the BTM savings that businesses realize during this entire period, 2020 through 2030, actually pay down debt or replenish retained earnings, and there's therefore no economic impact. The excess savings from 2027 through 2030 constitute additional investment, which creates positive impact in REMI. This is because we assume that businesses are more concerned with their balance sheets than our households, and because we assume businesses behave as if they want to maximize profit and households behave as if they want to maximize utility or well-being, the classical neoclassical approach, which may or may not be true. So this next figure shows the gross and net behind the meter savings for households and businesses. So next slide, please. So here we see the top bars, or the bars that go up above the zero line, are residential savings and business savings. And these savings accrue, and the lighter blue bars and the teal bars are the savings net of BTM spending in residential, are the blue bars that go, the darker blue bars that go below the zero line, and the teal savings are the savings net of BTM behind the meter spending for commercial and industrial. And you can see the net savings are negative until 2026. As I said in an earlier slide, they become positive to the tune of in 2030 about $1.2 billion for commercial and industrial, and just around a little bit more than $1 billion for residential savings in 2030. Next slide, please. So there is no reference case to compare the 45% midterm target that we had for the transportation and building sector. So the LEAP model uses a forecast of Connecticut's electricity load. We know what the history is. We get these numbers from the Northeast New England grid, and the build out of grid scale renewable and behind the meter generation that satisfies an increasing portion of the projected load. The projected load increase comes from switching from oil and gas appliances to heat pumps, and from fossil fuel powered vehicles to electric vehicles. So we established the expected load in 2019 as a base year, right? We just assume it's the same as in 2020. There's really no change. So the Department of Energy, Environment and Protection provide the annual fractions of behind the meter solar, fuel cells, and small hydro, as well as grid scale solar, wind and biomass, and fuel cells that we assume to contribute annually to the state's electricity load and reduce natural gas generation. So the geometric mean growth rate of these contributions over the forecast period scales the 20% contributions, that is the composition of those contributions back to 2019. So this next figure will show the percent contributions to the state's renewable portfolio from behind the meter and grid scale generation sources, including the year 2019, which is the last year we had data, because we're starting doing the study in 2018. So these are the renewable contributions to load. The top line is behind the meter solar. That's the blue line. The next purple line is sorry, the blue line. Yeah, the top blue line is grid scale in-state wind. The next purple line is grid scale in-state solar. Then the lines below that are behind the meter fuel cell, behind the meter solar, which is this line. You can't see my pointer, but it's the blue, the light teal line that sort of curves up below, goes through the orange line, and so on. So this is the contributions from all of the different generation sources. Next slide, please. And again, you can see the percentage. That's what these the scale is, the percent contribution to load from renewable sources. Next slide, please. So the next slide will show the portion of the state's load satisfied by the accumulating new renewable resources. That is primarily wind and solar, and some fuel cells. And we use fuel cells in Connecticut. It's ostensibly the fuel cell capital of the world. Fuel cells started here in the early 60s in the space program. Pratt & Whitney, I actually worked in the fuel cell facility there. The University of Connecticut has a fuel cell research facility, and there are several companies based here. Fuel Cell Energy is one of them that produce fuel cells. And Pratt & Whitney also, I'm not sure if it's still, or United Technologies, actually it's now Raytheon, may have a cooperative agreement with some Japanese companies in the fuel cell area. So this load satisfied, what this next graph shows, this is the actual effect of the 45% midterm target. That's the 45% reduction by 2030. What this shows, this will show the effect of this build out on the state's electricity load. So let's look at that next slide. Let's look at that figure. So here we see the left scale, this is in gigawatts, gigawatt hours, I should say. So the red portion of the bar represents Connecticut's total load, which is the 45% scenario, less cumulative renewable capacity added. And the green bars are the cumulative capacity added, plus, this is grid scale capacity added, plus behind the meter. So the total renewable obviously consists of the grid scale from utilities, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, grid scale solar, as well as behind the meter from residences and commercial industrial establishments. So the total, you can see there's a decreasing fraction of the grid scale and an increasing fraction from behind the meter, contributing to the total projected Connecticut load. And you can see that it takes a dip. This is primarily following population trends and the uptake of heat pumps and electric vehicles, slowly declining, but then increasing again in the years 2026 through 2030. So this shows the contribution of each of these sectors, behind the meter and grid scale, as well as cumulative renewable resources added. Next slide, please. So, oh, please go back one. So this one shows a percent of total load, and these now add up to 100% each year. So this, the red bars show that the total Connecticut load for this particular midterm target, less the accumulated renewable capacity added. So this is the same as the graph before, but based on 100%. So you can see that there's an increasing, this may be actually more meaningful, the increasing percentage of behind the meter solar and wind, well, behind the meter solar as a percent contribution to the whole across this modeling period from 2020 to 2030. Next slide, please. This slide shows the load added by type and percent of total gigawatts added for this midterm case. That's their case under consideration. So the tall bars on the left, there's a group of 4 bars in each year. The tall bars are grid scale solar, representing more than 45%, 47% there, steadily declining. What's increasing is the red bars, which is wind, onshore wind as well as offshore wind. There are huge investments in offshore wind taking place in New England, in Long Island Sound, and off the Massachusetts coast, off Cape Cod. Also declining there is the second bar is fuel cells in declining percentage, and also decreasing is biomass. So this shows the additions of renewable sources by type over the modeling period. Next slide, please. So we assume that as we add renewable generation to the total load, it displaces natural gas. We're assuming that our nuclear capability remains. This next figure shows the cost savings to the utilities in terms of foregone cumulative natural gas fixed and variable O&M costs and fuel costs. That's the sum of the negative bars, as we'll see in just a second. The natural gas cost savings to the utilities does not offset the lost revenue from BTM production, because as somebody adds solar to their house, they buy less electricity from the utility. And we count this as reduced revenue, the lost revenue to the utilities. So the positive bars in this next figure represent the net saving for households and businesses, which is their gross behind the meter savings, less their capital fixed and variable O&M costs and fuel costs. The lost revenue to utilities appears in this next figure. Actually, there's the one after this, and is the gross savings that households and businesses realize from putting solar on their roof. For reference, the annual and cumulative gigawatt hours of natural gas displacement appears on the right-hand scale of this next figure. So let's look at that. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing here, the orange bars represent the cumulative behind the meter electricity savings, less gas, fixed, variable, and O&M, plus fuel costs attributable to, please go to the, I think you want to go to the previous slide. Yeah, just stay here for a second. Nope, next slide, please. Right here, just stay here for a second. Anyway, the orange bars represent the cumulative behind the meter savings, less gas, fixed, variable, and O&M and fuel costs attributable to total renewable production. The top line represents the annual grid and BTM gas displaced in gigawatt hours. The line below that, the teal line or the light blue line, represents the cumulative grid and BTM gas produced in displaced in gigawatts. So the annual grid and then cumulative, right? That's those two top lines. The green bars below, green and blue bars below, you can hardly see them, but the green bars, what you can see is the cumulative fuel cost for grid plus BTM gas displacement. So we're displacing gas on the one hand, and we're adding renewable as the sources for grid scale electricity. Next slide, please. So here are the gross and net household behind the meter savings, and these can go into REMI. So the top above the zero line, we see the red and the blue. The blue bars are the cumulative residential savings, and the red bars are the cumulative business savings, and that's commercial industrial. Below the zero line, the green and the purple bars, the green represent the cumulative net residential savings, and the purple bars represent the cumulative net. So the top are gross and the bars below are net, and the net becomes positive just in 2028 for residential and for business in 2029. Next slide, please. So we assume that households borrow at very low rates or lease to obtain their rooftop solar. We assume that households do not purchase fuel cells. They spend their savings on other goods and services, even though their net BTM savings is negative. So consumer allocation can either be positive or negative. That's a REMI policy variable. We model household expenditure for solar and small hydro. Small hydro is sort of typically run of the river. We have a lot of rivers and streams, and people can install run of the river generating systems in their property. So we model this as household maintenance expenditure. Businesses realize a positive net saving from behind the meter investment in 2029, as we saw in that graph, and in 2030, which they invest during that period, and this contributes to economic impact. Between 2020 and 2028, we assume businesses invest in behind the meter solar and fuel cells with retained earnings or by going to the capital market to obtain needed funds. Just to give you an example, it was mentioned that I did teach at Trinity College. They put in a large fuel cell that will heat and cool most of their buildings on campus at a much more efficient rate. So just to give you an idea, if you capture the heat generated by the exothermic process and the electricity generated, you have an overall thermal efficiency of greater than 80% from fuel cells. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the net investment picture. So what we see here is the bars. The green bar is annual net grid scale investment less total cumulative gas plant displacement. The blue bar is residential BTM investment, behind the meter investment. The red bar is commercial industrial behind the meter investment. The lines and the lines are in kilowatt hours. So the lines are on the right-hand scale, and the top line, the orange line, represents cumulative added grid scale plus BTM behind the meter in kilowatt hours, and the blue line represents cumulative added grid scale in kilowatt hours. So one is with behind the meter and one is without behind the meter. Okay, next slide, please. So we don't consider the decommissioning because every plant, nuclear or gas or oil fired, has a life, useful life, and we don't consider these decommissioning costs or the nuclear plants as renewable sources displace them. Some may be decommissioned before their useful life, simply because they're not needed. They've been displaced by wind or solar. These costs would likely, if they were decommissioned, the cost would likely be borne by investors and do not affect electricity rates beyond those necessary to build out the decarbonized grid. Okay, I think we can look at results. Next slide, please. So this, again, is the REMI result in terms of jobs and gross domestic product. Gross domestic product starts off roughly, this is the change from the baseline. That's what we're reporting. REMI shows you changes from baseline. Is about $100 million, and it declines to about, let's see, I'm looking at, yeah. So it starts off about plus 100 million and declines to almost $1 billion. Jobs start off very positive at around 2,200 jobs and decline to almost 1,400 jobs. What's going on here? Well, we are making investments in residential and commercial industrial behind the meter. On the other hand, we actually have declining sales from electrical generation plants. So many of them leave the market and they are displaced by onshore, offshore wind and solar farms. So that's what's going on here. And the next slide will show us the fiscal picture for the electricity sector. Next slide, please. So here again, we have mostly a deficit due to this declining jobs and therefore the taxes that are thrown off by these jobs. And despite the net uptake of, the decline in electricity sales from fossil fuel. So we have declining natural gas. We don't have any oil burning plants in Connecticut, so this is primarily decline in natural gas sales, offset by the increase in behind the meter generation of electricity. So what we need to do now is combine all three sectors, the transportation, building, and electricity sector, and I think we can see that in the next slide. Next slide, please. So here we combine the three sectors, and now primarily due to the building sector, we see a positive result. The bars represent jobs on the right-hand scale, and we see primarily again due to the building sector, an increase of 23,000 jobs in 2025 and 22,000 jobs in 2030. The orange line represents gross state product. It starts off increasing in 2020 by about $1.9 billion, peaks at about in 2025, just around 2.5 billion, and levels off at 2030, just about maybe a little over 2.5 billion. The fiscal picture is in the next slide, please. We're putting these all together. And again, we have, for the first sort of half of the period up to 2025, it looks like we have a net surplus. And then from 2025 on, we have a net deficit. Again, I must say that these numbers, while they're showing surplus and deficit, they're also very small. So we're talking a net deficit of about $60 million and a surplus of $60 million in 2020, and the largest the deficit gets is about another $60 million, $70 million in 2030. And this is in a $22 billion state budget. So not big numbers. Okay, next slide, please. So if we look at this in, rather than in dynamic terms, just in simple sort of average changes over the period without incentives or accounting for policy costs, which is very important. We haven't, other than the existing rebates for electric vehicles, we have not modeled any other policy cost incentives or rebates or preferential borrowing rates to incentivize these uptake of electric vehicles, heat pumps, and so on. We have neglected the policy costs or health and environmental co-benefits. So what we see here in the summary table is the net economic and fiscal impacts of the combined sectors, transportation, building, and grid scale, GHG reduction strategies. And so total employment, the average annual change from the reference case is 22,000 jobs. which is a 0.9%, very small change. Our employment or labor force in Connecticut is about 1.7 million. For reference purposes, state GDP is about 234. Average annual change is 200. That's million, not billion. 234 million, which is 0.62% of our about $22 billion budget. Revenue, sorry, that is 234 billion. It's a 220 to 230 billion dollar economy. Something is wrong with that number. State GDP, 234 billion. The revenue and the expenditure for the state revenue, these are very small numbers, 136 million, 128 million out of a $22 billion budget. So this is a typical way to summarize. You look at the annual average changes of whatever variables that are meaningful, and primarily it's gross state product, jobs, and revenue and expenditure of the state budget. These are the primary quantities that decision makers, legislators are interested in. So let's look at the next slide, please. So our conclusions is that among them, we assume that Connecticut's greenhouse gas reduction strategies occur in isolation. So anytime you use REMI to model anything, you're modeling some change, positive or negative, in your state or in your region, and this is done in isolation. The changes are not occurring in other places. So there will be, because REMI is connected via trade, it knows the trade flows to and from all states, and you have open migration, so there's capital and labor migration. If you have something occurring in your state that creates increased relative employment opportunity, workers will migrate to your state. The negative or the opposite will occur if something negative happens. So if other states are not implementing their own GHG strategies, then modeling the transition to a greener, healthier Connecticut economy occurs in the absence of similar changes in other states' economies. So when viewed in isolation, some households and businesses may migrate to lower cost regions, because we can see from this study that costs will go up. But such an inducement to move may diminish of all areas where similarly addressing the global problem of climate change. So costs would go up everywhere and would mitigate the outflow of capital and labor. So recall that we have not modeled the health or other co-benefits from reducing emissions that would positively affect these results, or the costs or incentives of policies that would be necessary to induce the transition envisioned in this analysis that would negatively affect these results. So until these offsetting results are modeled or effects are modeled, these results, we must regard them as preliminary, because there will be costs to implementing policy, rebates, grants, lower interest rates, preferential interest rates, as well as positive co-benefits that would result in increased decreased morbidity and decreased mortality. So we didn't model those things because, as I said, the EPA took down their Cobra model, and that we simply did not have a handle on what policy costs, what policies, and how much they might cost. So this is a grand thought experiment, but it sort of paints the picture of what it would be like to transition from a carbon economy to a low carbon economy, and all of the things that would occur in the process of that transition. Next slide, please. So the paper is on the Department of Energy Environmental Protection website. As I said, it was finished in December 2018. We collected data that year, most of that year. So the data is based on 2018, and then modeling assumptions through the LEAP model through 2030, actually through 2050, but we decided to truncate it at 2030 simply because the results beyond then would be highly uncertain.